Skill 6, proving congruent angles. One theorem that we've already learned about is vertical angles theorem, which says that vertical angles are congruent to each other. So we're going to use that information to find x in these two problems. For A, we have one angle is 2x plus 21. The vertical angle to that one is 4x. So if I were to solve this, I want to set them equal to each other because I know that this angle is congruent to this angle. So 2x plus 21 is equal to 4x. And then I just have to solve for x. So minus 2x and I have 21 equals 2x. And then I'm going to divide by 2. So x equals 21 halves, or 10.5. And that would be your final answer. The next one, we have one of the vertical angles equals 3x, the other one equals 2x plus 40, and we know they're set equal to each other, so we have 3x equals 2x plus 40. And I'm going to solve that. So subtract 2x from both sides, and I'm left with 3x minus 2x, which is just x, equals 40. So x is 40, and that's your final answer. For example 2, we are going to use the vertical angles theorem to prove different things. So we're going to suppose that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And then we're going to show that angle 2 is also congruent to angle 3. So we know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. So that's actually the first bit of information we know. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 4 because it is given to us. The next thing we're going to look at is what else can we say based on this picture and those two facts. Well, I can go a step further and say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. Why would that be? Well, they are vertical angles, so that's the reasoning there. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 4 by the vertical angles theorem. Now the next thing we're going to look at is 1 and 2. We want angles 1 and 2, see what we can say about those. Well, since angle 1 is congruent to angle 4 and angle 2 is congruent to angle 4, then that must also mean that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And that's just using algebra, mixing and matching. So we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 by algebra, or more specifically the transitive property, by setting things that are equal or congruent to each other. Next step is 4. Now let's go back to looking at what we're trying to do. We're trying to prove that 2 and 3 are congruent. So that means we probably have to go and do something with angle 3. Well, I can say that angle 3 is congruent to angle 1 by vertical angles as well, just like in step 2. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 by the vertical angles theorem. And the last thing, if we look at 1 is congruent to 2 and 1 is congruent to 3, then we can do again the algebra transitive property and say 2 is congruent to 3. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 by the transitive property of algebra. So that's the end of our proof, and the reason that is because we have reached what we wanted to show. So we write QED, which means it's proved, we're done. Or you might put a box and shade it in. Proof is over. In this next proof, what we want to do is we want to suppose that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and we're going to show that 1 is congruent to 2, which is congruent to 3, which is congruent to 4. So we want to show that they're all congruent to each other. Okay, so for this first one, we have what we're given. We are given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 by our given. Now the next step is to show that everything else is also congruent to those two things. So we can do this by a process of elimination. We're going to start with the idea that we know that angle 2 is also congruent to angle 4 because of vertical angles. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 4 by the vertical angles theorem. But if we look a little bit further, we can also see that angle 1 and angle 3 follow the vertical angles theorem. So they're also congruent by the same reasoning. So on that same line, I'm going to write angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 by the vertical angles theorem. Since they're both the same reasoning, you can put them both on the same line if you want. The next step is to do some mixing and matching with the algebraic transitive property. Since everything has congruence to each other, then we can mix and match and use algebra to solve. So therefore, angle 1 is congruent to angle 4, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 by algebra, the transitive property, and just setting the different ones congruent to each other. So finally, if we put all those things together, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, which is congruent to angle 3, which is also congruent to angle 4, and that's also by algebra. That is your final answer, and your proof is done. So those are your notes over skill 6, proving congruent angles. Summarize your notes. Make sure you understand how to use these different theorems in your proofs. Go through some practice problems, and then you should be ready for your quiz over this material.